The wrench slipped. Daniel Reyes caught it before it hit the concrete, the same way he'd caught 1,000 small failures in his life, quietly, before anyone noticed there had almost been a disaster at all. His hands still remembered things his life no longer asked of them, the exact pressure to seat a bolt without stripping it, the particular give of a torque wrench right before it clicked past spec. Sometimes, closing up the shop at night, he'd catch himself running a thumb along a shelf bracket just to check the weld, and have to remind himself nobody here was paying him to notice things like that anymore. 3 years ago, his hands had done a different kind of work. He had signed off on crash test telemetry for a company called Holloway Dynamics, the kind of company that put its name on billboards next to words like the future of driving. He had been the one who noticed the numbers didn't match the footage. He had said so, once, in a conference room with too much glass and not enough honesty in it. A week later he was gone, his credentials pulled, his name attached to a falsified report he never wrote, his signature forged onto a sign-off sheet he'd never seen. Some stories take a while to show you why they matter, this is one of them, so stay close, and if you like where it's headed, subscribing helps more of these find you. Now he worked at Ferris Hardware, on Cedar Street, fixing lawnmowers and cutting keys, and nobody there knew that the man behind the counter had once decided whether a car was safe enough to carry a family down a highway at 70 miles an hour. His daughter Sophia was 6, and she believed with total confidence that her father could fix anything, bicycles, broken toasters, the neighbor's fence, her own bad dreams. Every morning she sat on the counter at Ferris Hardware doing her times tables while he opened the shop, her sneakers swinging above the floor, and every evening she asked him the same question, "Did you fix something good today?" He always said yes. He never said what he used to fix. The shop smelled like machine oil and cut lumber, and Daniel had come to like that smell the way some men like the smell of rain. He knew which drawer held the odd-sized washers without looking, knew by the weight of a customer's footsteps whether they'd come in with a real problem or just wanted company for 20 minutes. Old Mr. Ferris, who owned the place and trusted Daniel more than he'd ever say aloud, let him keep his own hours around Sophia's school schedule, no questions asked. It was a small life. Daniel had built it deliberately small, the way you build a room with low ceilings after a fire, because low ceilings don't fall as far. The town of Milbrook was the kind of place where everyone recognized everyone, except Daniel had made himself into the kind of man nobody looked at twice, flannel shirt, quiet voice, hands that moved with a precision none of his customers ever thought to question. He kept a small brass level in his truck's glove box, the one thing he'd taken with him when he left the old life behind. He never explained it to anyone. Some habits you don't explain. You just keep checking, because a structure doesn't fail all at once. It fails quietly, long before it falls. He met Eleanor Whitfield on a Tuesday, in the parking lot of the Cedar Street Market, 3 stores down from his own. She was 78, silver-haired, dressed with the kind of care that suggested she'd once mattered to a lot of people, and she was standing over a spilled bag of groceries while a younger man in a delivery uniform laughed at her, loud enough for the whole lot to hear, something about how she should get someone to walk her around like a dog on a leash, since she clearly couldn't be trusted to carry her own bread. Daniel didn't remember deciding to cross the lot. He just did. He crouched, gathered the oranges rolling toward the storm drain, and said nothing to the delivery man at all, which somehow embarrassed the man more than shouting would have. Eleanor's hands were shaking, not from age but from something sharper, something closer to humiliation. "I don't need help," she said, in a voice that clearly meant "I do, and I hate that I do." "I know," Daniel said. "I'm just here anyway." He drove her home in his truck with the groceries in the flatbed, and he didn't ask what her name meant to anyone, because at that point it didn't occur to him that it should. What he didn't know, what nobody at Ferris Hardware or Cedar Street Market knew, was that Eleanor Whitfield's late husband had founded Holloway Dynamics 40 years earlier, and that her daughter now ran it. Her daughter was worth $11 billion, and hadn't visited her mother in 4 months. In the truck, Eleanor noticed the small brass level sitting in the open glove box and asked what it was for. Daniel almost said nothing. Instead he said, "A structure doesn't fail all at once. It fails quietly, long before it falls. You learn to check things twice, in my old line of work. He didn't explain what the old line of work was. Eleanor didn't ask again, but she remembered the sentence, and turned it over for days afterward, the way you turn over something that sounds like it belongs to a bigger story than the one you're being told. That evening, Sophia asked her father why he'd helped a stranger instead of coming straight home. Daniel started to explain about kindness and about doing the right thing, and Sophia, 6 years old, cross-legged on the kitchen floor with a coloring book, said, without looking up, "You always help people you don't know. You never let anybody help you." He didn't have an answer for that. He just made dinner. Eleanor began asking Daniel for small favors, a leaking faucet, a stuck window, a garden gate that wouldn't close, and each time she watched him work, she noticed things that didn't fit a hardware clerk's resume. He diagnosed a failing water heater by sound alone before he'd touched it. He referenced tolerances and load calculations without thinking, the way a person recites a phone number they memorized decades ago. Once, fixing a loose porch railing, he muttered a number, a stress figure, a torque spec, that Eleanor, who had spent 30 years married to an engineer, recognized as exactly the kind of shorthand her husband used to use. She didn't confront him. She was too used to people underestimating her to make the same mistake twice. Instead she started paying closer attention, the way she used to at her husband's dinner parties, when engineers would talk shop and she'd learn to hear what mattered underneath the jargon. One afternoon she watched Daniel replace a section of her fence and noticed he sighted down the post twice before setting it, checking it against some invisible standard only he could see, muttering a tolerance figure under his breath the way her husband used to before a big presentation. When she asked him, lightly, if he'd ever built anything bigger than a fence, he went quiet for just a beat too long before saying no, and changing the subject to Sophia's school play. Eleanor let it go, out loud. She didn't let it go anywhere else. Instead, she made a phone call to the one person who could actually find out who Daniel Reyes used to be, her daughter, Clare. Clare Whitfield hadn't answered her mother's calls in weeks, buried under board meetings for Holloway's newest product launch, a fully autonomous highway driving system called Continuum, 6 months from release, already promised to 3 major manufacturers. But she'd hired an assistant precisely so nothing from her mother went unanswered twice, and this time, out of guilt more than curiosity, she picked up. "There's a man helping me around the house," Eleanor said. "He used to work in your industry. I think something happened to him that shouldn't have." Claire almost let it go. She had 100 fires to put out that week, but something in her mother's voice held her attention. She asked for a name. When her assistant ran it, the file that came back was thin, redacted, and stamped with a termination reason that read falsification of safety data, attached to a man whose separation agreement had been signed the same month as a fatal accident that Holloway had finally settled before it ever reached the press. Claire had been in the room, 3 years ago, when the board discussed that accident. She remembered a name being mentioned as the engineer at fault. She did not remember it being Daniel Reyes. She mentioned the name once, carefully, to a young systems engineer named Priya Anand, who had joined Holloway only a year earlier and had no stake in protecting anyone's past. Priya's reaction was immediate and strange. She went quiet, then asked to speak somewhere the office couldn't overhear. She told Claire that new hires were still warned, informally, never to bring up the Reyes report around Voss, though nobody could say why, and that she'd once found a partial data file in a decommissioned server with Daniel's initials on it, time-stamped days before his termination, that didn't match anything in his official record. She'd assumed, at the time, it was nothing. Now she wasn't sure. It was Priya who quietly pulled the archive logs that would later prove which login had altered the crash test report, and Priya who agreed, nervously but without hesitation, to testify to what she'd found if it ever came to that. Weeks passed. Eleanor began inviting Daniel and Sophia to dinner, more for her own loneliness than any plan, and Sophia, perceptive in the unfiltered way 6-year-olds are, asked Eleanor one evening why she seemed sad even when she was smiling. Eleanor didn't have an answer ready. Sophia filled the silence herself. "My dad gets that smile too. It means something's missing, but you're being polite about it." Eleanor laughed, surprised, and then quietly excused herself to the kitchen, where she stood for a long moment before returning with dessert. Clare drove to Milbrook the following weekend, officially to see her mother, privately to see the man her mother wouldn't stop mentioning. She arrived at Ferris Hardware in an unremarkable car, dressed down enough that no one recognized the CEO whose face had been on 3 business magazine covers that year. She watched Daniel from across the store for 10 minutes before approaching, studying the way he explained torque settings to an elderly customer with a chainsaw problem, translating complicated mechanics into plain, patient language. When their eyes finally met, something passed between them that neither could name yet: recognition without memory, the sense of 2 people standing on either side of the same old wound without knowing it was the same wound. She introduced herself only as Clare. Not as CEO. Not, yet, as Eleanor's daughter. The man responsible for Daniel's ruin was Richard Voss, Holloway's chief operating officer, who had been quietly running the company's day-to-day operations since before Clare's father died. It was Voss who had pushed the original Continuum prototype through crash certification 2 years ahead of schedule, and it was Voss who had ordered the telemetry logs altered when Daniel refused to sign off on results that didn't match the footage from the test track. The accident that followed, a test driver seriously injured, a family paid to stay silent, had never officially happened, according to Holloway's records. Voss had buried it under Daniel's name and moved on, confident no one would ever connect a hardware store clerk in Milbrook to a cover-up 3 years old. Now, with Continuum's public launch 6 months away and built on the same falsified baseline data, Voss had every reason to make sure Daniel Reyes stayed exactly where he was: forgotten, discredited, silent. He had risen to chief operating officer in the years since, had a corner office with a view of the test track where the accident had happened, and had trained himself never to look directly at it when he passed. When Voss learned, through a nervous junior engineer, that Clare had been asking questions about an old test track incident, he did what men like him always do first: he started covering his tracks quietly, before anyone could prove there was anything to cover. Clare found the evidence herself, alone, on a Sunday night in Holloway's server archive, a folder Voss had assumed no one still had reason to open. Buried inside were 2 versions of the same crash test report, the one submitted to regulators, clean and passing, and an earlier draft, unaltered, showing a structural failure in the vehicle's collision avoidance sensor under conditions nearly identical to the accident that followed. Daniel's original notes were attached to the unaltered draft, timestamped 2 days before his termination, flagging the exact failure that later injured a man on a closed track. His signature on the falsified sign-off sheet, by contrast, didn't match his handwriting anywhere else in his file, a detail so obvious that only someone determined not to look would have missed it. Clare sat with the files until nearly 2 in the morning. She thought about her father, who had built this company on the idea that machines should never be allowed to fail the people trusting them. She thought about Voss, who had stood beside her at her father's funeral, who had taught her how to read a balance sheet when she was 26 and terrified of the job she'd just inherited. And she thought about a man in a hardware store who fixed strangers' porches and never once asked for anything back. She called Priya at 2:30, apologizing for the hour, and asked her to quietly verify the server login on the falsified file before anyone else could touch it. By morning, Priya had confirmed it. The alteration had come from a terminal registered to Voss's executive assistant, on a day Voss's own calendar showed him working from that same office. It was a small detail, the kind of detail careless men leave behind when they've never once imagined being caught. Clare printed it twice, once for the board, and once, she decided, for no one but herself, so she would never again mistake a familiar face for a trustworthy one. The next morning, before Clare had decided what to do with what she'd found, she stopped by Eleanor's house and found Sophia there, drawing at the kitchen table while her father repaired a cabinet hinge nearby. Sophia looked up at Clare with the plain, assessing look children give adults who are pretending to be fine. "You look like you found something you didn't want to find," she said. Clare, startled, asked how she could tell. Sophia shrugged. "That's how my dad looks when he thinks about his old job. Like it's a puzzle piece that doesn't fit anywhere anymore." Clare didn't answer. She just looked at Daniel, working quietly across the room, and understood, for the first time, exactly whose puzzle piece she was holding. Clare called an emergency board meeting for the following Thursday, framed publicly as a routine review ahead of Continuum's launch. Voss walked in expecting formalities. He found instead a conference room with the original, unaltered crash test report projected on the wall beside the falsified version submitted to regulators, side by side, discrepancy by discrepancy, timestamped and traceable to a server login that belonged to him and no one else. Clare didn't raise her voice. She laid out the sequence of events with the same precise, procedural authority she used to close every acquisition she'd ever run: the date of the original failure report, the date of the altered sign-off, the date of the accident, the date of the settlement, the date Daniel Reyes was terminated, 2 days before the cover story could have held up under any real scrutiny. She named the falsified signature. She named the buried settlement. She named, finally, the engineer whose warning had been silenced and whose name had been used to bury it. Voss tried to object. He said the discrepancy was a clerical error, that old servers misfiled timestamps all the time, that Clare was chasing ghosts to avoid the pressure of a launch date. It might even have worked, if Priya Anand hadn't stood up from the far end of the table, hands shaking slightly, and confirmed under her own name that she had pulled the login records herself, that the terminal in question had never been used by anyone but Voss's assistant, and that she had a signed timestamp to prove when she'd found it, well before this meeting had ever been scheduled. The room went very still. Voss looked at her the way men like him always look at the people they assumed would stay quiet. He tried once more, quieter this time, to argue procedure over substance. Clare let him finish. Then she reminded the board, calmly, that the same falsified baseline data sitting underneath Voss's objection was the same data Continuum's collision avoidance system had been certified against, meaning every car built on it carried the same unexamined flaw that had already injured one man on a closed track. Nobody in the room needed the rest explained twice. By the time security escorted him from the building, the board had already voted, unanimously, to halt Continuum's launch pending an independent safety review, to open a formal inquiry into the settled accident, and to publicly and permanently clear the name of a structural engineer none of them, until that week, had ever met. Daniel found out what Clare had done not from a phone call, but from Eleanor, who drove to Ferris Hardware herself and sat quietly on the stool by the register while he closed up for the night. She told him everything, the report, the board, the vote, in the plain, unhurried way she told him everything, and when she finished, Daniel didn't say a word for a long moment. He just turned the brass level over once in his hand, the way he always did when something in him needed steadying. Clare came to Milbrook that weekend, not as a CEO with news to deliver, but as a woman who had spent 3 years not knowing whose life her company had quietly ended. She found Daniel and Sophia at the small park behind Cedar Street, Sophia running ahead toward the swings while Daniel walked at an unhurried pace behind her. Clare fell into step beside him. Neither of them said anything about apology, or gratitude, or what came next. They simply walked, matched pace for pace, until Sophia called out for her father to push her on the swing, and Daniel excused himself with a small, unpracticed smile Clare hadn't seen from him before. Later, as the sun went down, Clare reached into her coat pocket and handed him something small and cold and familiar, a second brass level, identical to his, engraved this time not with his old company's name, but with a single line: "A structure doesn't fail all at once." "I had it made this week," she said. "I thought you should have one that isn't just a reminder of what went wrong." Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He reached over and took her hand, briefly, the way you check something was steady before trusting your full weight to it. 6 months later, Ferris Hardware still opened every morning at 8, and Sophia still did her times tables on the counter before school, though now she sometimes did them out loud to Eleanor instead of the empty shop. But some mornings now, Eleanor sat with her, drinking coffee slowly, no longer counting the days since her daughter last called, because the calls had stopped needing to be counted at all. Holloway's independent review had confirmed everything Priya's record suggested, and Continuum relaunched a year later than planned, under Daniel's name this time, listed quietly in the safety documentation as a consulting engineer, not for the money, which he mostly didn't need anymore, but because Clare had asked him to, and because some structures, once you've spent years walking away from them, are worth the trouble of walking back. And some evenings, Claire drove up from the city just to sit on Daniel's porch while he checked, out of old habit, that the railing was still level, because he had learned, a long time ago, that the things worth protecting are rarely the ones that fail loudly. They're the ones somebody quietly keeps checking, long after everyone else has stopped looking. If this one stayed with you, there are more stories like it waiting for you at Velvet Storiez Tales, so if you'd like to walk into the next one with us, subscribing is the simplest way to make sure you don't miss it.